Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Peters for your continued attention to the issue of Homeland Security and terrorism and for convening this hearing today. I'd also like to thank all of today's witnesses for their lifelong dedication and attention to public safety and for your efforts to protect our citizens and keep the United States homeland safe, secure, and free. Those thanks also go to everybody who is here from local and state law enforcement. Homeland Security is a team effort and a team mission, and I am very, very grateful for all of your efforts. And a special thank you to the 9/11 National Memorial Museum, Ms. Greenwald, to your staff for hosting us on this hallowed ground. It is such a moving tribute to all of those who perished nearly 18 years ago today. I, like many people on the panel, have a lot of memories about 9/11, but I think the most significant one for me was the feeling I had when I picked up my then 8-year-old daughter from school and realizing how much her world had changed. As I sit here, I am once again overwhelmed by our country's profound loss that day and the sacrifices made by first responders, by the military and civilians, and by their loved ones. In some ways, 9/11 changed our country forever, but our response reinforced who we are. We are strong, we are kind, we are resilient, and at times and in places such as this one, we are reverent, and we will fight for and protect our freedom. I wanted to turn to all three of our secretaries because I've been dealing at home in New Hampshire with members of different houses of worship who are now increasingly concerned for their safety. No one of any faith should have to fear for their life when they visit their house of worship for reflection and prayer. And sadly, as we've talked about over the past few years, Americans have witnessed an increasing number of threats to and violent attacks on houses of worship, both at home and abroad. These threats are not confined to major metropolitan areas. Over the past months, I have visited with members of houses of worship in New Hampshire and heard about the disturbing threats that they and their communities have received. One rabbi noted that they now only open the doors to the temple shortly before services begin and lock the doors shortly after the start of services. In addition to being concerned about that limitation on the openness that always should mark a house of worship, this rabbi says as she leads her congregation during those minutes when the doors are open, she wonders, is this the night we die? A few of these houses of worship received a small amount of funding from the Department of Homeland Security's nonprofit security grant program in order to help secure them against these threats. These funds help, but not all who applied for the grants were able to get them, and there is much more to be done to keep houses of worship in New Hampshire and across the country safe, secure, and free. So Secretary Chertoff, the nonprofit security grant program was created during your time as DHS Secretary. Secretaries Napolitano and Johnson, the program continued to expand under your watch, but so have the threats. Can each of you share with me your thoughts about how the Congress, the Department, and the entire federal government can work to keep soft targets like house of worship safe from threats? And Secretary Chertoff, why don't we start with you?
Well, I mean, this has always been a very challenging issue, and obviously houses of worship are very sensitive. We've seen it in schools, and we've seen it in commercial establishments, and it is impossible to lock down everything and have a free society. I do think the grants help, and I do think, frankly, I've observed during certain holidays in various houses of worship, the police sometimes are hired to do some overtime and do some protecting. Some of it is training and advising people about what to do if there's an active shooter, for example. And then the third piece of this has to be, again, better intelligence sharing. But I'd be kidding you if I were to say there's an absolute way to stop this. This is a question of risk mitigation. I don't think you can get risk elimination, but we ought to do the best we can, and we ought not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Thank you. Secretary Napolitano.
Yeah, I think there's a real insight into what Secretary Chertoff said. We can't lock down an open society. But what we can do is to help mitigate risk. The grant program helps, active shooter training helps, additional local law enforcement resources during particular holiday periods may help. It really requires using a menu of approaches. There's not one single approach.
Secretary Johnson.
So the grants program you mentioned, what I was struck by when I would look at the grants every year is the program was well known in certain communities, but not others.
Right.
And certain communities had figured out year after year how to apply, how to get the grants, but it was not well known enough across the full spectrum of organizations it was intended to help. And so I hope that we have moved in a direction where there's larger awareness over the last couple of years, and that's something I suspect Congress can help with in your respective states and districts. And they're all competing, obviously, for the same fixed pot of money. So perhaps Congress should consider raising the level of funding for these types of things, because I agree with your assessment of the threat.
Thank you. The other thing I wanted to touch on is something that others have mentioned too, on the issue of cyber threats. But I wanted to focus a little bit on what's happening locally. Recent ransomware attacks designed to cripple government operations have targeted nearly every level of government, including a county, Stratford County in New Hampshire, and we've seen attacks on cities across the country. So is there more we can do for the federal government to assist state and local governments with deterring, preventing, and recovering from cyber attacks?
Well, let me just begin by saying I think one thing that could be done would be to help localities do some basic things to secure their infrastructure, including things like, for example, having backups for data.
Yeah.
It's not going to eliminate the problem, but it's going to reduce the issue.
Impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, helping mitigate the risk is important, and also I think we ought to be exploring what the federal government can do and is doing by way of attribution to help find the source of these attacks so that an appropriate response can be constructed.
Thank you.
I think the single best thing anyone can do in that situation is raise the level of awareness about security among the people that use the system. You'd be surprised the number of people who don't know how to respond to a suspicious email. And a lot of these attacks begin with an act of spear phishing. Somebody opened an email or an attachment they should not have opened. And so simply raising the level of awareness among people we entrust with the system goes a long way.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm pleased to report that our county officials did recognize a phishing email when they got it, and they had a pen and pencil backup system in place as they shut things down. But it's going to be something we need to continue to focus on. Thank you all again for your service and for your testimony here today.